Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Dave Mihelsic. He's the head of strategy and technology for Juniper Networks. Dave, good to have you in.
Thank you.
Let's talk about digital transformation first. It's a word you hear a lot, and in a sense, the first computer was a piece of digital transformation, 50 years ago. But what does the term mean today, and how do you see it manifesting itself as you look across government agencies?
So what it means to me is I think we're going to go from sort of this inadvertent transformation that's been going on for years inside the federal government and industry to a more purposeful transformation where federal organizations are going to leverage technology to improve service delivery to the public as well as to their internal stakeholders, whether those be the President of the United States or a private in the United States Army.
So a digital service, I guess we tend to understand what it means collectively. Sometimes I don't think we define it that carefully. But my sense is that it's applications to the public that call from multiple databases for whatever it is a person is seeking an answer.
Right, absolutely. Not just an answer, but potentially a service, retiree Social Security benefits, Medicare benefits, etc. So what we need to do is give the same experience to a citizen of the United States for these public-facing services that they've grown to expect from Netflix or Uber.
And so how does an agency make that happen? Because so they're, even to this day, pretty much transaction-oriented and inward-looking in many of the ways they approach IT.
So I think the way that they make that happen is to look how the leading companies in the industry have made that happen. Leverage technology such as the Internet Protocol and the Internet itself, the cloud, and then modern development techniques such as Agile to deliver these internet scale services that can meet the public's demand for both information as well as services themselves.
So when you have agile development, that means that you have some larger picture in mind, but you attack it a bite at a time, I guess is the best way, is one way to put it.
Right, absolutely. Traditionally in something called waterfall development, the way you ran a project was you did could be a multi-month, could be a multi-year in the case of large software programs, planning event where you determine all of the requirements and then the software design a priori before you started writing a single line of code. And the disadvantage of that is you would spend a lot of time planning, less time implementing, and oftentimes you recognize that changes were required as you were executing, but it was really too late to do those in an efficient fashion. So if you wanted to actually make the change, it required significant replanning events, significant delays, and additional cost. So what Agile tries to do is you have a broad vision in mind, but that you work in very small increments or sprints to understand what is the priority to deliver today for this week, this sprint. It could be a number of days or weeks or even months, and then focus on developing and delivering that. And then, once again, go back to the stakeholders, the ones who own that project, and work with them on a continuous basis to refine those requirements and deliver usable capability as quickly as possible.
Now, agencies tend to know what they need for their internal purposes, say a logistics system in the military or something like that. But when you're deploying Agile, or when you're deploying services to the public and you want to use Agile means, I guess the question is, how do you know what the public really wants? I mean,
So, one approach could be to bring the public into the development cycle to actually use end consumers as part of your process, to work with them, to use storyboards to describe what it is they want to do and how they want to do it. So I think if you went to a grandmother in Southern Illinois and asked her what was wrong with the way she interacted with the Social Security Administration, she'd have a pretty good idea of what they could do to make that interaction more seamless for her. So potentially bring that stakeholder into the conversation.
and a lot of agencies have forms that they send out in writing, or I guess for them, the first stage of digital transformation is you could have a PDF on your site and then people could download the form and then send it in, this kind of thing. But when you have multiple forms, I guess maybe Agile really applies to those situations, for example, because you can do one form at a time and try to get that right until the whole bundle of forms. And there are agencies that have dozens, hundreds of forms from a single agency for many, many different purposes.
Right. So an initial step might be to take those paper forms, make them digital, make them PDFs that can be saved, that the end user can fill in and save that data. You could move to the next step, which would be pre-populating those forms. You could move to digital signature, so no longer would the consumer, the citizen, have to print them out and physically sign them at the end of the process. They could apply a digital signature. And then moving even further forward, you could eliminate the form itself, the PDF, and move to a web portal, and they could have as much information as possible pre-populated, and they could just answer those critical questions, assert their identity through some secure electronic means, and request the service.
Now, some of the legacy businesses, I guess banks, maybe financial institutions, airlines, and so forth, have found a way to incorporate their old legacy applications, which still function. They still do what they're supposed to do 30, 40 years in some cases after they were originally launched. And so having the view that Juniper does of the entire network and everything that's going on it in a given agency or given business, what's a good strategy for incorporating or transforming or somehow making use of that legacy code, which is pretty hard to retire sometimes?
So it's a function of both legacy code and, perhaps more importantly, the existing data. We're not going to call it legacy because it's not legacy. It's data that's potentially very important. So you want to be able to expose that data and expose those legacy pieces of code as functions through standard APIs, application programming interfaces, and then those data as well as those software functionalities can be leveraged by new, more innovative Web 2.0 applications.
So you really have to peel away the data in some cases from its dependence on a particular application, really the original architecture tied together, maybe a flat database and some application. But the data is there if you can just extract it for reuse.
Extract it, loosely couple it. So it's no longer tied to a particular application. It's just data that's available. It's searchable, it's accessible in a secure fashion, and it can be used for the original purpose. A home address might have been in a database to mail a check, and now that home address can be used to pre-populate the requests for all services the government tries to provide to end users.
And what about mobility? Because if you read the statistics, more and more people are doing more and more mobily. But, in the case of government, you've got to accommodate forever, more so than a commercial entity, all the possible means of access that people would have. And it may be that, grandma is not ever going to have a tablet or a mobile device.
Well, perhaps. I think that not only government but industry needs to accommodate whatever mechanism an end user is going to try to use to access these services and these data elements. And that's going to require mobility. And I don't think it's a good assumption that grandmother won't use mobile data. So my dad, he's 86 years old. He recently moved from his iPhone to an Android phone because he likes that experience better, and he interacts with citizens-based services through that platform.
All right, so then maybe government is maybe a little too conservative in how far out it moves into the digital services arena, if you will.
Well, I think that not just the government, but across any industry, if you don't have a mobile strategy, if you're not exposing whatever you are providing through some sort of mobile interface, you're probably going to fail.
All right, let's take a break on that note. My guest today is Dave Mihelsic. He is head of federal strategy and technology at Juniper Networks. I'm Tom Temin. This discussion is From Disruption to Cohesion, the next step in digital transformation, sponsored by Juniper Networks, here on federalnewsradio.com and Federal News Radio 1500 AM.